Take these $85,000, sign this 12-page non-disclosure agreement, and vanish from my son's life forever. You are nothing but a smudge on his biography." Those were the last words I heard from Beatrice Vanderbilt 10 years ago, delivered with a surgical precision that cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. Today, that same woman is on her knees in my glass-walled office at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, smearing $60 Chanel mascara across her face as she sobs at the feet of the woman she once tried to erase. My name is Morgana Stone. I am 34 years old, and I am the Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, the only surgeon in the tri-state area capable of performing the complex ex vivo lung perfusion and transplant that can save her only heir, Julian. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now, let me take you back to the sweltering July afternoon in 2014 when the world I had painstakingly built was liquidated for the price of a mid-range luxury sedan. In those days, I was a 24-year-old medical student surviving on black coffee and the sheer adrenaline of ambition. Julian Vanderbilt was the sun around which my universe orbited. We met in the hushed, dust-moated aisles of the Yale University Library, a classic trope that felt like destiny until his mother decided it was a tragedy. Julian was the prince of a real estate empire worth nearly $400 million, a man whose family name was etched into the cornerstones of Manhattan's most prestigious skyscrapers. I was the daughter of a waitress and a long-haul trucker from Scranton, Pennsylvania, a girl whose most valuable possession was a stethoscope my mother had bought by working double shifts at a roadside diner for 3 months. To Beatrice Vanderbilt, I wasn't a partner for her son. I was a parasitic infection that needed to be sterilized. The day of our final confrontation is burned into my sensory memory with agonizing clarity. We met at the street. Regis, New York, on East 55th Street, in a private suite that cost more per night than my annual tuition. The air conditioning was humming at a clinical 68 degrees, and the scent of fresh lilies was so thick it felt like a funeral. Beatrice sat behind a mahogany desk, her fingers adorned with a 5-carat Harry Winston diamond that caught the light with every dismissive wave of her hand. She didn't offer me tea or a seat. She simply slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood. Inside was a cashier's check for $85,000 and a legal document prepared by a firm that charged $1,200 an hour to make people like me disappear. She told me Julian was destined for a senator's daughter, a girl whose pedigree matched the Vanderbilt silver, and that my presence was an unsightly blemish on his meticulously curated future. She threatened to use her influence to ensure I never saw the inside of an operating room if I didn't comply. I was young, terrified, and I knew that against the Vanderbilt machinery, I was a gnat. I took the money, signed the NDA with a shaking hand using a Mont Blanc pen she didn't even let me keep, and I walked out into the New York humidity, leaving my heart on the 22nd floor of that hotel. I used every cent of that blood money to disappear into my studies. I buried the girl who loved Julian under layers of academic excellence and surgical coldness. I moved to Minnesota, far from the social circles of the Upper East Side, and I climbed the ladder of the medical world with a ferocity that bordered on the psychotic. I specialized in the cases no one else would touch, the high-risk transplants where the margin for error was thinner than a silk suture. By the time I was 32, I was earning a base salary of $580,000 a year, living in a minimalist penthouse at the Berkman with a view of the clinic towers, and driving a 2024 Obsidian Black Porsche Taycan Turbo S that I paid for in cash. I didn't need the Vanderbilt's charity anymore. I had become the architect of my own empire. Then, 3 days ago, the past came screaming into my present. A life flight helicopter landed on the roof of the Mayo Clinic at 2:14 a.m., carrying a 36-year-old male with end-stage cystic fibrosis exacerbated by a sudden, catastrophic pulmonary infection. When I reviewed the chart, my breath hitched in my throat. Patient, Julian Vanderbilt. Primary contact, Beatrice Vanderbilt. The man I had once planned a life with was dying, his lungs becoming 2 heavy, useless stones in his chest. His family had flown him halfway across the country because every other surgeon had looked at the complexity of his previous surgeries and the current state of his pleural cavity and said no. I was his last hope, the only person with the steady hands and the specific expertise in robotic-assisted thoracic reconstruction to give him a chance at another sunrise. Which brings us to this moment in my office. Beatrice didn't recognize me at first. To her, I was just Dr. Stone, the cold, distant specialist in the charcoal gray scrubs and the white coat that bore the clinic's seal. She had spent 45 minutes pacing my office, complaining about the wait time and demanding to see the Chief of Surgery, not realizing she was looking at the smudge she had tried to wipe away a decade ago. When I finally sat down, adjusted my glasses, and looked her directly in the eyes, the realization hit her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of parched parchment. The arrogance that had defined her for 60 years evaporated, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. Now she is on the floor, her knees pressing into the expensive Persian rug I bought to celebrate my promotion. She is begging. She is offering me millions, promising to fund an entire research wing in my name, swearing she will give me anything if I just save her son. I look at her, and I don't feel the burning rage I expected. I don't feel the triumph of revenge. I feel a profound, icy silence. I remember the way she looked at me in the St. Regis, as if I were something she had stepped in on the sidewalk. I remember the nights I spent crying in a cramped dorm room, wondering if Julian ever looked for me, or if he had simply accepted the senator's daughter as his new reality. I found out later there was no senator's daughter. It was just another one of Beatrice's carefully constructed illusions to maintain control. I stand up from my desk, my movements deliberate and slow. The hum of the clinic's ventilation system is the only sound in the room, a steady, clinical rhythm that reminds me where I am and who I have become. I walk around the desk and look down at her. She reaches out to grab the hem of my white coat, her fingers trembling, her manicured nails chipped from the stress of the last 48 hours. I gently move back, out of her reach. I am not the girl from Scranton anymore. I am not the smudge on her biography. I am the woman who holds the power of life and death over the only thing she actually loves. I think about the $85,000. In the world of high-stakes medicine, that amount wouldn't even cover the cost of the specialized immunosuppressant regimen Julian will need for the first 6 months post-op. It wouldn't cover the hourly rate of the surgical team I would need to assemble for a 12-hour procedure. To her, it was a fortune to buy my silence. To me, it is now just a rounding error on a hospital billing statement. I look at the clock on my wall, a sleek, minimalist masterpiece that cost $4,000, and I see it is nearly 4 p.m. The window for Julian's surgery is closing. Every hour we wait, the inflammation in his chest cavity increases, making the transplant more dangerous. I should tell her that I will do it because I am a doctor and I took an oath, but there is a part of me that wants her to sit in the agony of her own making for just a few minutes longer. I want her to feel the weight of every word she spat at me 10 years ago. I want her to understand that the people she deems disposable are often the only ones who can fix the messes she creates. I reach for my phone, a titanium-framed device, and I pull up Julian's latest CT scan. The images are haunting, the gray shadows of his failing lungs a stark contrast to the vibrant man I once knew. He is an innocent in this, a victim of his mother's suffocating ambition just as much as I was. Beatrice looks up at me, her voice a broken whisper, asking me if I will save him. I don't answer her immediately. I walk to the window and look out at the Rochester skyline, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the snow-dusted streets. I think about the concept of family and the price of dignity. Beatrice Vanderbilt thought she could buy both and discard the rest. She thought she could curate a life like a gallery exhibition, removing any piece that didn't fit her aesthetic. But life is messy, and blood is thick, and the past has a way of performing its own surgical strikes when you least expect it. I turn back to her, my face a mask of professional neutrality. I tell her that I am going to review the pre-operative labs one more time and that my assistant will bring her the consent forms. I tell her that the cost of this surgery will be astronomical, but not in a way that can be paid with a cashier's check. It will cost her the last shred of her pride. She will have to sit in that waiting room, surrounded by the ordinary people she despises, and she will have to pray to a God she hasn't spoken to in years that the smudge she tried to erase has a steady enough hand to stitch her world back together. Family isn't the name on a skyscraper or the money in a trust fund. Family is the person who stands between you and the abyss when everyone else has turned away. For 10 years, I had no family because of this woman. And now, in a twist of fate so sharp it feels like a physical wound, I am the only family her son has left that can actually do anything to keep him breathing. I leave her there on the floor of my office, a broken monument to a dying era of arrogance, and I walk toward the surgical suites. My footsteps echo on the polished linoleum, the sound of a woman who finally knows exactly what she is worth. As I scrub in, the water hot and the soap stinging my skin, I realize that the best revenge isn't seeing her fail. It's being the only reason she succeeds. While the Vanderbilts were purchasing 60-foot azimuth yachts and bragging about $200,000 charity donations at gala events in the Hamptons, I was grinding through the brutal reality of a surgical residency that demanded every ounce of my sanity. Every single cent of that $85,000 hush money, which Beatrice Vanderbilt had handed over with such disdain, went directly into my medical tuition at Yale and my subsequent living expenses. I viewed that money not as a gift, but as a loan from my own dignity that I intended to pay back with interest by becoming the most formidable surgeon they had ever seen. My primary mode of transportation during those grueling years was a rusted 2012 Ford Focus in a fading shade of tuxedo black, a car with 185,000 miles on the odometer and a transmission that groaned every time I shifted into gear. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial-strength disinfectant, and the driver's side window would often get stuck halfway down, forcing me to drive through the biting Connecticut winters with the heater blasting at full capacity just to keep my fingers from going numb. While my ex, Chase Vanderbilt, was dropping $5,000 a night at exclusive clubs like Surf Lodge or South Point, ordering bottles of Ace of Spades champagne that cost more than my monthly rent, I was falling asleep over massive, leather-bound anatomy textbooks in the quietest corners of the medical library. My living situation was a stark contrast to the sprawling Vanderbilt estate in Greenwich, with its heated marble floors and 16-car garage. I lived in a 380-square-foot studio apartment in a pre-war building where the elevator was perpetually out of service, and the radiator clanked like a dying engine in the middle of the night. The faucet in the kitchenette, which was really just a single sink and a 2-burner hot plate, dripped with a rhythmic, maddening precision, exactly 14 times every single minute. I would lie awake on my mattress, which I had found for 60% off at a warehouse clearance sale, counting those drips and imagining they were the seconds of my life ticking away while I waited for my real career to begin. I was eating 99-cent packs of Maruchan ramen for the 4th or 5th time that week, occasionally splurging on a single egg or a handful of frozen spinach to give it some semblance of nutritional value. The total cost of my weekly groceries rarely exceeded $35, a figure that wouldn't have even covered the tip on one of Chase's casual Tuesday lunches at Le Bouquet. There were nights when the sheer exhaustion threatened to break me, when the weight of the anatomical diagrams and the complex chemical equations felt like they were crushing my chest. I remember one specific Tuesday in November when the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees, and my Ford Focus refused to start in the hospital parking lot after a 36-hour shift. I sat in that freezing car, my breath blooming in white clouds against the windshield, and I looked at a social media post that someone had tagged Chase in. He was on a private jet, a Gulfstream G650, holding a crystal glass of Macallan 25 and laughing with a group of people who looked like they had never known a day of genuine struggle in their entire lives. The caption mentioned something about a quick weekend getaway to St. Bart's to escape the New York chill. At that moment, I could have felt envy, or I could have felt regret for signing that NDA and walking away from the Vanderbilt fortune. But instead, I felt a cold, sharpening resolve. I knew that his lifestyle was built on the shaky foundation of inherited wealth and the exploitation of others, while I was building a foundation of granite. I would spend my rare hours of freedom at the local public library or in the hospital's research lab, poring over surgical journals and practicing my suturing technique on discarded pieces of latex and pig's feet I bought from the butcher for $2 a pound. I became obsessed with the mechanics of the human heart and lungs, fascinated by the way a few millimeters of precision could mean the difference between a patient walking out of the hospital or leaving in a body bag. While Chase was learning how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the New York elite, I was learning how to navigate the intricate web of the pulmonary arteries and the delicate tissues of the mediastinum. I knew the name of every muscle, every nerve, and every vessel in the human thorax, with more intimacy than I had ever known the names of the guests at the Vanderbilt's annual garden parties. Every time I looked at that 12-page non-disclosure agreement, which I kept tucked away in a cheap plastic folder under my bed, it served as a reminder of the price of my silence and the value of my future. Beatrice Vanderbilt had called me a smudge on her son's biography, a temporary inconvenience that could be scrubbed away with a checkbook. She didn't realize that a smudge, if given enough time and pressure, can become a permanent mark. She didn't realize that by trying to erase me, she had provided the very fuel I needed to burn brighter than any of the socialites she tried to set Chase up with. I worked triple shifts at the hospital, taking the night rotations and the holiday shifts that no one else wanted, just so I could earn the extra $100 bonuses that helped pay for my board exams. I remember the exact cost of those exams, nearly $3,000 for the various steps and certifications, and how I had to save for 8 months, skipping meals and walking 2 miles to the hospital to save on gas, just to afford the registration fees. The financial disparity was a constant, gnawing presence in my life. I had a spreadsheet on my 5-year-old Dell laptop where I tracked every single penny. Rent was $850, utilities were $72, and my student loan interest was growing at a rate that made my stomach churn. I was existing on the fringes of a world that celebrated excess while I was perfecting the art of survival. I watched from afar as Chase was promoted to a senior vice president role at his father's firm, a position handed to him on a silver platter along with a 6-figure signing bonus and a company-issued Mercedes-Benz S-Class. I, meanwhile, was being praised by my attending surgeons for my ability to remain calm during a tension pneumothorax, or for my meticulousness in closing a thoracotomy incision. Their praise didn't pay the bills, but it was a currency that Beatrice Vanderbilt couldn't buy and Chase couldn't inherit. I remember the smell of my studio apartment, a mixture of old wood, cheap laundry detergent, and the lingering scent of that ramen. I remember the sound of the neighbors' muffled arguments through the thin walls and the sirens that screamed past on the street below. But mostly, I remember the feeling of the anatomy textbook in my hands, the weight of the knowledge I was consuming. I was transforming myself, cell by cell, into a weapon of clinical excellence. I was no longer the girl who had been intimidated by the gold leaf on the St. Regis stationery. I was becoming Dr. Morgana Stone, a woman who understood that true power isn't found in a bank account, but in the mastery of one's own craft. When the Vanderbilts were hosting their lavish fundraisers for underprivileged youth, I was actually treating those youth in the city's underfunded public clinics, seeing firsthand the consequences of the systemic inequality that the Vanderbilts helped perpetuate. I saw the faces of the mothers who couldn't afford their children's asthma medication, and I felt a kinship with them that I would never feel with the women in Beatrice's bridge club. My struggle wasn't just about my own career. It was about proving that the value of a human life isn't determined by the zip code they were born in or the car they drive. My rusted Ford Focus eventually gave out on me, the engine finally surrendering on a rainy Tuesday in my 3rd year of residency, and I had to sell it for $500 to a junkyard. I took the bus for the next year, using the 45-minute commute to study for my specialized fellowships, while Chase was likely being chauffeured to meetings in a climate-controlled limousine. The contrast between our lives was so absolute that it felt like we were living in different dimensions. He was living in a world of velvet ropes and private entrances, while I was living in a world of sterile corridors and fluorescent lights. He was concerned with the vintage of the wine and the guest list for the Met Gala, while I was concerned with oxygen saturation levels and mean arterial pressures. But I knew, even back then, that a day would come when the bubbles in his champagne would go flat and the wealth wouldn't be able to protect him from the fragility of his own body. I knew that eventually, the Vanderbilts would find themselves in a situation that money couldn't fix, a situation where they would need someone like me, someone who had been forged in the fire of their contempt. I didn't hate them then, not really. Hate takes energy, and I needed every joule of energy I had to keep my eyes open during 12-hour surgeries. I felt a cold, clinical detachment. They were a case study in entitlement, a biological anomaly that I was observing from a distance. I was the surgeon, and they were the unsuspecting patients, and the theater was just being set. The $85,000 was long gone, dissolved into the coffers of the university, but the lessons I learned while living on the edge of poverty were permanent. I learned how to be precise when I was tired, how to be sharp when I was hungry, and how to be unbreakable when the world tried to bend me. I was the daughter of a trucker and a waitress, and I had more grit in my fingernails than the entire Vanderbilt lineage had in their entire bodies. So, when Beatrice Vanderbilt finally walked into my office at the Mayo Clinic, she wasn't just meeting a doctor. She was meeting the culmination of a decade of sacrifice. She was meeting the woman who had lived in that dripping studio, who had eaten that ramen, and who had driven that rusted Ford Focus until the wheels literally fell off. She was meeting the woman she had tried to buy, only to find out that I was now the one who set the price. The irony of her standing there, begging me to use the skills I had acquired with the very money she used to cast me out, was a surgical strike of fate so perfect it was almost beautiful. I looked at her smeared mascara and her trembling hands, and I remembered the clink of the radiator in my old apartment. I remembered the 14 drips a minute, and I knew that finally the debt was about to be settled, the point of no return. The exact moment the bridge between my old life and the person I was forced to become was incinerated, happened on October 14th at precisely 2:22 p.m. in the cold antiseptic light of the maternity ward at St. Vincent's Medical Center. I was lying in a hospital bed with a thin, scratchy cotton blanket pulled up to my waist, my body still trembling from the physical and emotional exhaustion of a 34-hour labor that had nearly cost me everything. My daughter, a fragile and beautiful creature who weighed only 6 pounds and 4 ounces, lay sleeping in a clear plastic bassinet beside my bed, her chest rising and falling with a rhythmic innocence that the world was about to shatter. The door to my room swung open with a heavy, deliberate thud, and Beatrice Vanderbilt stepped inside, looking as though she had just stepped off the cover of Town and Country magazine in a tailored charcoal wool suit that likely cost more than my father's annual salary. She didn't even glance at her newborn granddaughter, didn't look at the tiny, pink-tinged face or the delicate fingers that were currently curled into miniature fists. Her eyes remained fixed on me with a cold, predatory focus that made the air in the room feel thin and brittle. Without uttering a single word of congratulations or concern for my health, she walked to the bedside table and placed a single piece of paper and a heavy, gold-trimmed Mont Blanc fountain pen on the laminated surface next to my half-empty cup of tepid hospital water. It was check number 402, drawn from a private wealth management account at J.P. Morgan Chase, and the amount written in sharp, elegant calligraphy was enough to make anyone's head spin. Beside her stood my own father, a man who had spent 40 years driving a freight truck across the interstate highways only to find himself buried under a mountain of debt, owing the bank exactly $142,000 on a predatory subprime mortgage that was threatening to put him on the street. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his shoulders hunched in a posture of profound defeat, and whispered in a voice that cracked with shame that this was better for everyone. He told me that this money would save the family home, that it would give me a fresh start, and that I was too young to be tied down to a life of struggle and Vanderbilt lawsuits. They were standing there together, the billionaire matriarch and the broken blue-collar worker negotiating the sale of my soul as if they were trading a worthless penny stock on a Friday afternoon before the market closed. I can still vividly remember the smell of her Clive Christian #1 perfume, the most expensive fragrance in the world, a cloying mixture of bergamot and vanilla that smelled like expensive indifference and old, untouchable power. It filled the small, cramped hospital room, suffocating the scent of lemon disinfectant and baby powder until I felt like I was drowning in the sheer opulence of her presence. Beatrice leaned over me, her face a mask of calculated empathy that didn't reach her glacial blue eyes, and told me that Julian was already in London, that he had been convinced I had moved on with someone else, and that if I ever tried to contact him or claim the Vanderbilt name for the child, she would ensure that I was tied up in litigation for the next 40 years. She made it clear that I was a smudge, an error in the grand ledger of their family history, and that this check was the eraser. My father's betrayal was the blade that finally severed my heart. He wasn't just asking me to take the money, he was giving me his permission to be erased because it served his own financial survival. He chose the 4 walls of a house in Scranton over the flesh and blood of his own grandchild, and in that moment, as the clock on the wall ticked to 2:23 p.m., I realized that I was completely and utterly alone in a world that valued decimal points over devotion. I looked at the check, then at the pen, then at the tiny baby in the bassinet whose life was being auctioned off before she had even opened her eyes to the sun. I felt a coldness settle into my marrow, a crystalline hardness that has never truly left me. It was the birth of Dr. Morgana Stone and the final agonizing death of the girl who believed that love was a force stronger than a signature on a 12-page legal document. I picked up that Mont Blanc pen. It was heavy, balanced perfectly for a hand that never had to do manual labor, and I signed the papers that stripped me of my past and funded a future built on the ruins of my happiness. I didn't cry then. The tears had all turned to ice during the labor. I watched Beatrice pick up the signed documents with a satisfied click of her tongue, tucking them into her Hermes Birkin bag as if they were nothing more than a dry cleaning receipt. She didn't offer a parting word. She simply turned on her designer heels and walked out, leaving the scent of her perfume lingering in the air like a poisonous cloud. My father stayed for a moment longer, his hand hovering near my shoulder but never quite touching me, before he followed her out, leaving me in a silence so profound it felt like the end of the universe. That afternoon, I realized that the Vanderbilts didn't just own real estate and yachts. They owned the very air people like my father breathed, and they could cut off the supply whenever it suited their balance sheet. The $85,000 that eventually hit my account was a drop in the ocean for them, the equivalent of a weekend's docking fees for their Azimuth yacht. But for me, it was the price of a total transformation. I spent the next decade ensuring that I would never again be in a position where someone could place a pen in my hand and tell me what my life was worth. I lived in that 380-square-foot studio where the faucet dripped 14 times a minute, and every time I heard that sound, I was reminded of the heartbeat of the daughter I was forced to raise in the shadows of a legal agreement that forbade me from ever letting her know the truth of her lineage. I became a ghost in my own life, working those triple shifts until my eyes were bloodshot and my hands shook from caffeine, all while Beatrice and her family lived in a world of $200,000 charity donations and gala balls. I watched from the sidelines of the internet as the Vanderbilt empire grew, seeing photos of their sprawling Connecticut estates and their private jets, knowing that the foundation of their continued happiness was built on the silence they had purchased from a terrified girl in a hospital bed. I kept that Mont Blanc pen. I had swiped it from the table when she wasn't looking, as a souvenir of the day I learned that everyone has a price, and that the only way to be truly free is to become the person who sets the price. My father eventually lost that house anyway, despite the money I gave him, proving that you cannot save a man who is willing to sell his own daughter to pay a debt he never should have taken. He died 3 years ago, alone in a rented apartment, and I didn't even attend the funeral. I was in the middle of a complex aortic valve replacement, and I realized as I held a human heart in my hands that I felt more connection to the stranger on the operating table than I did to the man who had stood by and watched me be liquidated. The smell of that Clive Christian perfume still haunts my nightmares, a olfactory reminder of the day I became a commodity. It is a scent that represents a world where people are treated like assets to be managed or liabilities to be written off, a world I have spent my entire adult life learning how to dismantle from the inside. Every time I scrub in for a surgery now, as I feel the hot water and the surgical soap stripping away the layers of the outside world, I think about that hospital room. I think about the plastic bassinet and the check and the way the light hit the gold nib of the pen. I am no longer the girl who was pushed around by the Vanderbilt's legal team. I am the woman who has mastered the most difficult procedures in modern medicine, a woman who earns more in a month than that initial hush money payment was worth in total. I have built a life of surgical precision and emotional distance, a life where I am the one in control of the narrative. And yet, the irony is not lost on me that Julian is now lying in one of my ICU beds, his life hanging by a thread that only I can weave back together. The Vanderbilts think they can buy everything, but they cannot buy the steady hand of a surgeon who has been forged in the fires of their own cruelty. They cannot buy the years of expertise I gained while living on 99-cent ramen and sleeping on a warehouse clearance mattress. Beatrice is currently in my office, her $60 mascara ruined by tears that I suspect are more about the loss of her heir than the pain of her son, and she is finally realizing that there are some things in this world that do not have a price tag. I am the smudge that refused to be erased, the mistake that became the master, and the daughter she tried to discard who now holds the keys to her family's survival. The weight of the past is heavy in this room, heavier than the state-of-the-art medical equipment or the millions of dollars in research funding she is currently offering me. I look at her, and I see the woman who stood over my hospital bed 10 years ago, and I wonder if she remembers the smell of her own perfume on that day. I wonder if she remembers the way she didn't even look at the baby. Probably not. To people like the Vanderbilts, people are just footnotes, and the only thing that matters is the bottom line. But today, the bottom line is Julian's heart rate and the oxygen saturation in his blood, and for once, Beatrice Vanderbilt is not the one holding the pen. I am the one who will decide if this story ends in a recovery or a final silent flatline, and as I prepare to enter the operating theater, I realize that the $85,000 was the worst investment she ever made, because it bought her the very person who now knows exactly how much her silence is worth. After the heavy, mahogany-scented presence of Beatrice Vanderbilt had finally vanished from the maternity ward, taking with her the suffocating aroma of Clive Christian perfume and the hollow shell of a man I once called my father, the silence that rushed back into the room was more terrifying than the confrontation itself. It was 3:14 a.m. on October 15th, the dead hour where the world feels most fragile, and the fluorescent lights of St. Vincent's Medical Center hum with a low, clinical buzz that vibrates in your very teeth. My body was a map of exhaustion and trauma, my muscles still twitching from the adrenaline of the betrayal, and I knew that if I stayed in that hospital bed, the weight of what I had just signed away would crush my lungs before morning. I dragged myself out of the bed, the thin hospital gown fluttering against my legs, and retreated into the cramped, windowless sanctuary of the hospital restroom. I sank onto the cold, gray linoleum floor, the chill of the tiles seeping through the fabric of my clothes, and I leaned my head against the sterile white porcelain of the sink. I reached up and pulled a handful of those rough, tan-colored recycled paper towels from the metal dispenser, the sound of the paper tearing echoing like a gunshot in the small space. With a cheap ballpoint pen I had salvaged from the nurse's station, I drew a jagged, uncompromising line down the middle of the sheet, dividing my life into two distinct and warring territories. On the left side of that paper towel, I wrote two words in stark block letters: money and power. Underneath, I listed the $85,000 check that was currently tucked into the drawer of my bedside table like a poisonous snake, the Vanderbilt name, their fleet of Azimuth yachts, their Greenwich estates, and the 12-page non-disclosure agreement that was designed to be my cage. On the right side, I wrote, dignity and daughter. Under that, I listed the quiet, steady breath of the baby in the bassinet, my own medical degree that was yet to be earned, and the absolute burning necessity of a future where we were never again subjects to someone else's whim. As I stared at those two columns in the flickering light of the restroom, I realized with a clarity that only total devastation can provide that emotion is a trap designed for the poor. It is the luxury of those who can afford to be sentimental, a soft weakness that the elite like the Vanderbilts use to manipulate and discard people like me. Facts, I understood then, are the only weapons the elite truly respect, and if I was going to survive, I had to stop being a victim of my feelings and start becoming a master of information. I sat there for nearly an hour, the cold from the floor numbing my legs, as I formulated a plan that was as precise and cold as a surgical incision. The money they had given me to disappear was meant to be my golden handcuffs, a trail of breadcrumbs they could use to ensure I was behaving according to their script. But I knew the banking systems better than Beatrice gave me credit for. I knew that $85,000, while a fortune to a girl from Scranton, was a manageable sum to move through the digital ether if one was careful. The very next morning, before the ink on my discharge papers was even dry, I began the process of moving that hush money into a complex, locked trust fund established through a series of shell entities that even a private investigator would have a nightmare untangling. I didn't spend a single cent on myself. I lived on the 99-cent ramen and stayed in that 380-square-foot studio with the dripping faucet, treating that money not as a gift, but as a strategic reserve for the war I knew was coming. I wanted them to think I was struggling, to see me driving that rusted 2012 Ford Focus with the peeling paint and the 185,000 miles on the odometer, because as long as they thought I was poor, they thought I was powerless. But while the exterior of my life looked like the picture of a defeated, struggling single mother, the interior was becoming a fortress of documentation. I began keeping what I called my black ledger, a leather-bound notebook I bought for $6 at a pharmacy, which I kept hidden inside the ventilation duct of my apartment. In it, I recorded every single interaction I had ever had with a Vanderbilt, starting with the exact timestamp of Beatrice's arrival at the hospital, October 14th, 2:22 p.m., and the specific serial number of check number 402. I wrote down the exact phrasing she used, the way my father's hands shook when he looked at the floor, and the temperature of the room when I signed my name. I realized that the Vanderbilts operated on the assumption that the people they crushed would eventually forget the details, that the trauma would blur the edges of the truth until it became a messy, unreliable memory. My black ledger was the antidote to that arrogance. It was a verified, time-stamped, and meticulously detailed account of their cruelty, a repository of facts that no amount of their lawyers' billable hours could ever erase. I became obsessed with the details, recording the cost of every gallon of gas I put into my Ford Focus, the exact amount of my medical school tuition, and the dates of every gala or public appearance the Vanderbilts made that was reported in the social columns. If Chase was photographed at a charity event in the Hamptons while I was pulling a double shift in the anatomy lab, I noted the discrepancy. If Beatrice made a public statement about the importance of family values while her private wealth managers were sending me threatening letters about the NDA, I documented the hypocrisy. I was no longer just Morgana Stone, the medical student. I was a silent archivist of Vanderbilt sins, waiting for the moment when the weight of their own history would become too heavy for them to carry. I learned how to use the legal and financial tools of the wealthy against them, studying trust law and corporate structures with the same intensity I applied to thoracic surgery. I knew that one day the facts would be more valuable than the $85,000, and I intended to be the only person who held the full ledger. The paper towel from the hospital restroom became my mission statement, a rough, wrinkled piece of trash that I kept in a sealed plastic bag at the bottom of my trunk. It reminded me of the night I stopped being a pawn and started being a player in a game they didn't even know I was still playing. Every time I felt my resolve wavering, every time the exhaustion of working triple shifts made me want to give up and take a regular job, I would think about that line drawn down the middle. I would remember the coldness of the linoleum and the smell of the Clive Christian perfume, and I would feel the icy precision of my plan click back into place. I understood that the Vanderbilts viewed the world as a series of transactions, and they had mistakenly thought they had completed the transaction with me. They didn't realize that by paying for my silence, they had actually financed the education of their greatest adversary. I began to see my life as a series of data points, a long-term investment in a narrative that would eventually culminate in their exposure. I didn't care about the Azimuth yachts or the $5,000 nights in the Hamptons. Those were fleeting, ephemeral displays of wealth that left no lasting mark. What I cared about was the permanence of the record, the undeniable truth of what had happened in that maternity ward at 2:22 p.m. I knew that the elite rely on the silence of the people they hurt, assuming that the shame of being bought will keep them quiet forever. But I felt no shame. I felt only the cold, hard weight of the facts I was collecting. I was building a case, not just for a courtroom, but for a reckoning that would transcend the legal system. When I finally became a surgeon, earning that $580,000 salary and moving into my penthouse at the Berkman, I didn't stop the ledger. If anything, my access to the upper echelons of society only made my documentation more potent. I saw the Vanderbilts at professional functions, watched them from across the room at medical fundraisers, and I noted every silver hair on Beatrice's head and every nervous twitch in Chase's hands. I was a ghost in their world, a highly successful, respected professional who looked nothing like the girl they had discarded in Scranton. I was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very prestige they so desperately craved, while my black ledger grew thicker with every passing year. The $85,000 sat in its locked trust, growing with interest, a digital bomb waiting for its moment to detonate. I had become the person I needed to be to protect my daughter, a woman who could perform a robotic-assisted thoracic reconstruction with one hand and navigate a hostile corporate takeover with the other. I had turned their money into a shield and my trauma into a map. Sitting on that hospital floor at 3:14 a.m., I had made a choice to survive by becoming the very thing they feared most, someone who couldn't be bought because she already knew exactly what they were worth. The linoleum had been cold, the paper towel had been rough, and the betrayal had been absolute, but in that moment, I had drawn a line that no Vanderbilt would ever be able to cross again. I was no longer a smudge. I was the ink that was going to rewrite their entire history, one time-stamped fact at a time. The transition from a victim of circumstances to an architect of justice required a professional touch, so I sought out and hired a private investigator named Marcus, a former FBI agent specializing in white-collar crime and high-level surveillance who bills a non-negotiable $450 an hour. His office was a sterile, windowless bunker in an unassuming building in downtown Minneapolis, a space dominated by a curved desk supporting three 27-inch monitors that cast a cold, flickering blue light over his weathered face as we meticulously built the dossier that would eventually dismantle the Vanderbilt legacy. We spent hundreds of hours in that room, the air humming with the sound of cooling fans and the faint smell of ozone and burnt coffee, as we gathered 14 high-definition security feeds from various exclusive clubs and private estates that captured Chase Vanderbilt in compromising positions, clearly using illegal substances while believing his family name made him invisible to the law. Marcus had connections that spanned from the NYPD to international banking authorities, and he used every one of them to pull 38 forensic accounting reports that proved, with mathematical certainty, that Chase had been embezzling millions of dollars from the family's primary nonprofit foundation to cover his astronomical gambling debts in Macau and London. Each report was a masterpiece of financial detective work, detailing a labyrinthine trail of offshore accounts and falsified invoices that Beatrice Vanderbilt had spent years trying to camouflage behind the veneer of high society philanthropy. We sat surrounded by the glowing screens as Marcus pointed out the specific anomalies in the ledger, the $400,000 transfers disguised as administrative costs, and the ghost employees who were really just shells for Chase's personal expenditures. But the centerpiece of our collection, the piece of evidence that made the hair on my arms stand up every time I saw the waveform on the monitor, was what Marcus called the Holy Grail, a crystal-clear digital recording from a bugged conversation in the back of a luxury limousine. In it, Beatrice's voice was unmistakable, stripped of its public grace and reduced to a sharp metallic rasp as she referred to my innocent daughter as nothing more than a financial liability and a tactical error that needed to be permanently contained. Hearing those words, hearing the woman who shared my child's DNA speak about her as if she were a line item in a bankruptcy filing, solidified the ice in my veins into something even harder and more permanent than surgical steel. All of this evidence, every grainy video frame and every cold, hard percentage point of the embezzlement trail, sat in a 4-inch thick manila folder that I kept locked in a high-security safe in my home, waiting for the exact moment when the Vanderbilts' arrogance would collide with their desperate need for my surgical skills. I didn't want a quick settlement or a public scandal that would blow over in a few news cycles. I wanted a total, undeniable reckoning that would force Beatrice to look at the daughter she dismissed and realize that she had been outplayed by the very person she tried to buy for the price of a mid-range sedan. Marcus would often sit back in his ergonomic chair, rubbing his eyes and telling me that he had seen a lot of corruption in his 20 years with the Bureau, but the cold-blooded efficiency with which the Vanderbilts treated their own blood was something that even he found repulsive. We cross-referenced the dates in my black ledger with the findings in his dossier, creating a synchronized timeline of their hypocrisy that was as detailed as a mapping of the human genome. I remember the cost of every single hour Marcus spent on the case, the $42,000 in total fees I paid over 18 months, and I viewed it as the most important investment I would ever make, far more significant than any stock portfolio or real estate acquisition. While Beatrice was spending her money on Clive Christian perfume and Azimuth yachts, I was spending mine on the truth, purchasing the kind of clarity that only comes from deep-cover surveillance and expert forensic analysis. We had high-resolution photos of Chase entering a private apartment in Soho with individuals whose criminal records were longer than my surgical training, and we had the sworn affidavits from 3 former Vanderbilt employees who were tired of being treated like expendable assets. The dossier was more than just a collection of papers. It was a physical manifestation of my decade-long journey from the floor of a hospital restroom to the top of my profession, a weapon that I had forged in the silence they had imposed on me. Every time I looked at that folder, I thought about the 14 drips a minute in my old apartment and the 99-cent ramen that had sustained me while I dreamed of this day. I thought about my daughter, who was now a bright, thriving girl who knew nothing of the woman who considered her a liability, and I felt a fierce, protective pride that I was the one who would ensure she never had to fear the Vanderbilt name. Marcus once asked me if I ever felt guilty about the level of detail we were collecting, and I told him that I didn't believe in guilt when it came to the survival of one's dignity. The Vanderbilts had set the rules of this game 10 years ago, and I was simply playing it to its logical conclusion. The dossier grew heavier with each passing month, a weight that should have been burdensome, but instead felt like an anchor, keeping me grounded while I moved through the rarefied air of the medical elite. I knew that Beatrice would eventually come to me, not because she wanted to, but because the universe has a way of bending toward a specific kind of poetic justice. I knew that Julian's health was a ticking clock, and that the Vanderbilts' penchant for excess would eventually catch up to them, either in their lungs or their ledgers. The forensic accounting reports were particularly damning, showing that the family empire was much more fragile than they let on, held together by a house of cards that Chase was inadvertently burning down with every $5,000 night in the Hamptons. My role as the only surgeon capable of saving the family's future was the final piece of the puzzle, the leverage that would force them to open the door and let the truth walk in. Marcus had one monitor dedicated solely to the Vanderbilt's public social media and news feeds, a constant stream of manufactured smiles and staged charity events that looked increasingly absurd when compared to the reality in the Manila folder. We watched as Beatrice accepted awards for her commitment to the arts, knowing that the money for those plaques had been siphoned from a fund meant to support children's literacy. We watched as Chase was named one of Manhattan's most eligible bachelors, knowing that he spent his nights in a drug-fueled haze that would eventually leave him gasping for air on a ventilator. The contrast between the public Vanderbilt image and the private dossier was a chasm that I was preparing to bridge with a single, devastating move. The folder wasn't just about revenge, it was about the reclamation of a narrative that had been stolen from me at 2:22 p.m. in a maternity ward. It was the proof that the smudge on their biography was actually the author of their downfall, a woman who had used their contempt as a blueprint for her own success. I had learned how to think like a Vanderbilt, cold, calculating, and focused on the long-term objective, but unlike them, I had a moral compass that had been calibrated in the harsh light of Scranton, Pennsylvania. I wasn't doing this to take their money. I already had more than enough of my own. I was doing this to show them that some people cannot be silenced, and that the truth, when presented with surgical precision and backed by 14 high-def feeds and 38 forensic reports, is the only thing that can truly bring an empire to its knees. The day Marcus finally handed me the completed dossier, bound in that heavy manila paper and sealed with a red wax stamp he used for his most sensitive work, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in 10 years. The weight of the folder in my hands was a comfort, a physical reminder that I was no longer that girl on the linoleum floor. I was Dr. Morgana Stone, a woman who held the life of Julian Vanderbilt in her hands and the reputation of the entire Vanderbilt family in her briefcase. As I left Marcus's office for the last time, the cold Minneapolis wind biting at my face, I looked up at the clinic towers and knew that the stage was set for a performance that Beatrice Vanderbilt would never forget. The dossier was ready, the facts were verified, and the only thing left was for the lights to go up and the curtain to rise on the final act of a story that they thought they had finished a long time ago. Tonight, the Vanderbilt family is hosting their annual Golden Heart Gala, an exercise in performative empathy held within the gilded, vaulted ceilings of the Grand Ballroom at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan for 120 of the tri-state area's most elite guests. The rental for this single room alone cost $25,000, a sum that could have funded a year of life-saving medications for a dozen children at my clinic, and the catering is a staggering $180 per plate, excluding the vintage Krug champagne that flows like water from silver ice buckets. Beatrice is the centerpiece of the evening, draped in a custom midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown that features thousands of hand-sewn crystals designed to catch the light of the 3,000-pound Swarovski chandeliers hanging above. She is preparing to take the stage to announce that her son, Chase, is a brave hero fighting a sudden, mysterious illness, a narrative carefully crafted to elicit sympathy and mask the reality of the drug-fueled collapse that actually put him in my intensive care unit. I arrive at the hotel in my 2024 Obsidian Black Porsche Taycan Turbo S, handing the keys to a valet whose eyes widen at the sight of the ceramic brakes, and I walk into the ballroom at exactly 8:15 p.m. sharp, moving with the cold, calculated intent of a predator. I am wearing a sharp black three-piece suit tailored by the artisans at Savile Row and my Tom Ford glasses, the thick, dark frames acting as my armor against the superficial glitter of this world, and clutched in my left hand is the 4-inch thick manila folder that contains the end of the Vanderbilt era. The room goes silent as I cross the threshold, the sea of designer silk and tailored wool parting instinctively as the guests sense a shift in the atmosphere that has nothing to do with the temperature of the air conditioning. The heavy, cloying smell of seared Wagyu beef and the effervescent sting of expensive champagne hits me, a sensory overload that usually signifies celebration. But I feel nothing but a profound, absolute ice in my marrow. I see the faces of people who have ignored me for a decade, people who looked through me at the St. Regis, and people who laughed when my father slid that DNA test across a table, and I realize that none of them matter anymore. Beatrice is standing on the small, velvet-draped dais, a wireless microphone in her hand, her face a masterpiece of practiced grief and stoic elegance that she has perfected over 60 years of high society manipulation. She freezes when she sees me. The microphone let out a sharp, piercing squeal of feedback that echoes against the marble walls, and for a fleeting second, the mask of the Vanderbilt matriarch cracks, revealing the terrified woman who knelt on my office floor just a few days ago. I do not stop at the edge of the crowd. I walk directly up the center aisle, my handmade Italian leather shoes clicking against the parquet floor with a rhythmic, surgical precision that mirrors the dripping faucet of my old 380-square-foot studio. Every eye in the room is fixed on the Manila folder, that unassuming collection of paper that holds 14 high-definition security feeds, 38 forensic accounting reports, and the digital recording of Beatrice calling my daughter a financial liability. As I reach the front of the room, I can see the fine lines of age that the $60 Chanel mascara can no longer hide, and I can smell the Clive Christian perfume, that scent of expensive indifference wafting off her skin in waves. She tries to regain her composure, her voice trembling as she begins to speak into the microphone, attempting to welcome me as the brilliant doctor who is helping her son. But I raise my hand with a slight, dismissive gesture that cuts her off mid-sentence. The silence in the ballroom is now so thick it feels physical, a vacuum of sound where the only thing that exists is the confrontation between the smudge they tried to erase and the architect of their ruin. I think back to October 14th at 2:22 p.m., to the cold linoleum of the maternity ward and the 12-page non-disclosure agreement that was supposed to be my cage, and I feel a surge of power that is cleaner and sharper than any surgical tool I have ever used. Beatrice is looking at the folder with a mixture of horror and fascination, realizing that the game of transactions she started 10 years ago is finally reaching its final settlement, and that the currency is no longer dollars, but the absolute, unvarnished truth. I am not here to make a speech or to ask for an apology that would be as hollow as the Vanderbilt's charity donations. I am here to serve as the physical manifestation of every fact I have collected in my black ledger. The elite think they can buy silence and curate biographies, but they forget that the people they discard are the ones who learn how to navigate the shadows where the real secrets are kept. I stand there in my Tom Ford glasses, looking out at the 120 guests who represent the pinnacle of Manhattan wealth, and I realize that the only person in this room with any real power is the woman who spent her nights eating 99-cent ramen and studying the mechanics of the human heart. The weight of the Manila folder is a comfort, a heavy, tangible proof that I have successfully moved the Vanderbilt sins from the realm of gossip into the realm of evidence. I can feel the heat of the stage lights on my face, highlighting the charcoal gray silk of my waistcoat, and I see the fear in Beatrice's eyes as she glances toward the exit, looking for the security team that she usually uses to remove inconveniences. But they won't move. They are paralyzed by the same curiosity as the guests, wondering what could possibly be in the folder that would make the Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at the Mayo Clinic walk into a gala like a debt collector. I haven't said a word yet, but the story is already being told in the way I hold my shoulders and the way I refuse to look away from her. This is the moment I envisioned when I was drawing lines on a paper towel at 3:14 a.m., the moment where the facts become the weapons of the girl they tried to make poor. Beatrice's hand, the one adorned with the 5-carat Harry Winston diamond, is shaking so violently that the microphone head is rattling against her teeth, a rhythmic clicking that reminds me of the 14 drips a minute. I step closer until I am standing just inches from her, and I can see the sweat beaded on her upper lip despite the 68-degree climate control. I am the smudge that became a permanent stain, the liability that became an existential threat. and the daughter-in-law she tried to liquidate who is now the only person standing between her son and the morgue. I look at the custom Oscar de la Renta gown, and I see it for what it is. A shroud for a dying legacy. A beautiful, expensive distraction from the rot that Marcus and I uncovered in that windowless bunker in Minneapolis. The embezzlement, the drug use, the cold-blooded dismissal of a newborn child, it is all here, bound in manila paper, and ready to be presented to the world if she takes one more step toward the microphone. I feel a strange sense of detachment, as if I am watching this scene from the observation gallery of an operating theater, analyzing the variables and waiting for the optimal moment to make the first incision. The guests are whispering now, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves in a Connecticut autumn, but I don't hear them. I only hear the heartbeat of my daughter, the girl whose future I am securing with every second of this silence. I have spent 10 years building a life that doesn't require the Vanderbilt's approval, a life built on surgical precision and the accumulation of undeniable data points. I have turned their $85,000 into a weapon and their contempt into a map, and now, as I stand in the center of their most prestigious event, I realize that the best revenge isn't seeing them fail. It's letting them know that I am the only reason they haven't already. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a name etched into the cornerstone of a skyscraper. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out, and in this room, there is no one left who truly stays for Beatrice Vanderbilt. They are here for the champagne and the Wagyu beef and the proximity to power, but the second the manila folder is opened, they will vanish like smoke in a windstorm. I am the only one who is truly present, the only one who sees her for who she actually is, and that is the ultimate cruelty I am inflicting upon her tonight. I am forcing her to look into the mirror of my memory and see the monster she became in that maternity ward at 2:22 p.m. As she opens her mouth to finally speak, to perhaps try one last desperate lie, I simply tap the edge of the manila folder against the podium, a soft, dull thud that sounds like the closing of a coffin lid. The sound is amplified by the microphone, booming through the ballroom and silencing the whispers once again. I am not a smudge on Chase's biography. I am the entire final chapter, the one that explains how the empire fell because they forgot that the people they step on are the ones who learn how to cut the ground from under their feet. The ice in my veins is absolute now, a clinical coldness that allows me to stand here without a single tremor in my hands. I am Dr. Morgana Stone. I am 34 years old, and I am the most dangerous person the Vanderbilt family has ever met because I am the only one they couldn't buy, couldn't break, and can't survive without. The gala continues around us, the lights twinkling and the champagne bubbling. But for Beatrice and me, the world has narrowed down to the 4 inches of paper between us and the 10 years of silence that are finally about to end. I do not scream. For screaming is the emotional release of the powerless, and I have never felt more grounded in my own authority than I do at this exact moment, standing beneath the suffocating weight of the Pierre Hotel's chandeliers. I walk with a slow, predatory grace straight to the mahogany podium, brushing past Beatrice as if she were nothing more than a piece of discarded stage dressing, and I open the manila folder with a deliberate, crisp sound that seems to amplify in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the room. The 120 guests, the titans of industry and the architects of Manhattan's social hierarchy are frozen in mid-motion, their crystal glasses of Krug vintage champagne hovering inches from their lips as I adjust the microphone with a cold, metallic click. I lean in, the light from my Tom Ford glasses reflecting the jagged edges of the truth I am about to exhale, and my voice comes out steady, clinical, and devoid of the tremors that defined my youth. I begin by pulling the first document from the folder, a high-resolution scan of a J.P. Morgan Chase bank statement for account number 8829, and I hold it up so the front-row guests can see the black-and-white reality of an $85,000 payment made exactly 10 years ago to erase a child and a woman from the Vanderbilt biography. I state the facts with surgical precision, noting the date, the timestamp, and the specific routing number, explaining that while this room was built on the myth of Vanderbilt legacy, the foundation is actually made of hush money and non-disclosure agreements. The air in the ballroom feels like it is thickening, the scent of the seared Wagyu beef turning cloying and sour as the guests begin to realize that this is not a testimonial, but a public execution of a reputation. I reach back into the folder and pull out the next piece of evidence, a multi-page toxicology report from St. Vincent's Medical Center dated September 12th, bearing Chase Vanderbilt's full legal name and date of birth. I read the results with the same detached professionalism I used during a morning morbidity and mortality conference. A blood alcohol level of 0.22 and a toxicological cocktail of narcotics that would have killed a man with a less expensive safety net. I look directly at Beatrice, whose face has turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray, and I ask the question that has been burning in the back of my throat since she knelt in my office. You are asking me to save this man as a surgeon, to use my hands and my decade of sacrifice to stitch back together a life that he has spent every night trying to dismantle? I don't wait for her to answer, because the answer is already written in the horrified gasps of her peers and the way the socialites in their $20,000 gowns are physically recoiling from her as if her arrogance were a contagious disease. Then, I signal to the 2 assistants I hired from Marcus's firm, who move through the crowd with the synchronized efficiency of a surgical team, handing out 120 high-quality copies of the 12-page non-disclosure agreement that Beatrice forced me to sign on that cold October afternoon. I want every person in this room to feel the weight of the paper, to read the clauses that prohibited me from ever mentioning the child I gave birth to, and to see the signature of a woman who thought she could buy the silence of a mother for the price of a mid-range luxury sedan. I hear a silver Villeroy and Bach fork hit a fine bone china plate with a sharp, crystalline clink that echoes like a gunshot against the marble pillars, a sound that marks the exact moment the Vanderbilt spell is broken forever. Beatrice Vanderbilt, a woman who has spent 40 years meticulously cultivating an image of untouchable grace and moral superiority, begins to age 20 years in a matter of 20 seconds. Her skin seems to sag away from her cheekbones, her eyes hollow out into dark pits of terror, and the custom Oscar de la Renta gown that was supposed to be her armor now looks like a shroud draped over a collapsing monument. I watch as her 40-year reputation, a fortress of philanthropy and social standing, dissolves in the span of a 4-minute speech, the facts of her cruelty acting like a chemical solvent on the gilded surface of her life. I detail the digital recording of her calling my daughter a financial liability, projecting the transcript onto the large screens that were meant to show a montage of Chase's fake heroics, and I watch as the guests read the words in stark, 30-point font. The room is no longer filled with the elite of Manhattan. It is filled with witnesses to a crime of the soul, and I am the prosecutor, the judge, and the surgeon who is finally removing the tumor of their influence from my life. I describe the 380-square-foot studio where the faucet dripped 14 times a minute while they were buying azimut yachts, and I see the shame on the faces of the people who used to toast to her health. I mention the 38 forensic accounting reports that prove Chase has been siphoning money from their charity for his gambling debts, and I see the donors clutching their pearls and their wallets, realizing that their generosity was nothing more than a fuel source for a Vanderbilt's addiction. Beatrice tries to reach for the podium, her fingers trembling so violently that her 5-carat Harry Winston diamond catches the light in a frantic, stuttering rhythm. But I do not move an inch to help her. I am the woman she called a smudge, the girl she tried to liquidate like a bad investment, and now I am the only thing in this room that is truly solid. I finish the speech by looking out at the crowd, my Tom Ford glasses reflecting the rows of stunned faces, and I tell them that as a doctor, I will still perform the surgery on Julian because I took an oath that transcends the filth of their family name. But I will do it as an act of professional duty, not out of any loyalty to the woman who tried to buy my daughter's existence. I tell them that after tonight, the name Vanderbilt will no longer be synonymous with power, but with a cautionary tale about what happens when you try to erase the wrong person. The silence that follows my final word is absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothers the sound of the air conditioning and the distant city traffic. The ballroom, which cost $25,000 to rent for this evening, now feels like a tomb for an era of arrogance that is finally coming to an end. I see the guests starting to stand, not to applaud but to leave, their Italian leather shoes scurrying toward the exits as they try to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of Beatrice's social standing. She is left standing on the dais, the midnight blue crystals on her gown sparkling ironically in the light of the Swarovski chandeliers, a queen with no kingdom and a mother whose secrets have been laid bare by the very woman she tried to destroy. I feel a sense of profound clinical closure, as if I have just completed the final, most difficult stitch in a 10-year-long procedure. I pick up my original manila folder, the paper slightly warm from the heat of the stage lights, and I walk back down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing with the same confidence they did when I walked into the Mayo Clinic for the first time. As I pass the tables, I see the 120 copies of the NDA scattered like discarded programs after a tragedy, the 12 pages of legal intimidation now reduced to nothing more than litter on the floor of the Pierre Hotel. I walk out of the ballroom and into the cool night air of East 61st Street, the city lights of New York stretching out before me like a map of endless possibilities. My 2024 Porsche Taycan is waiting at the curb, its obsidian paint gleaming under the street lamps, a symbol of the life I built without a single penny of their permission. I realize that for 10 years, I lived in the shadow of their money and their power, believing that I had to be a ghost to survive. But tonight I stepped into the light and found that the shadows were the only thing keeping them alive. I think of my daughter, sleeping soundly in a home built on truth and surgical excellence, and I know that she will never have to know the smell of Clive Christian perfume or the sound of a check being signed to make her disappear. The weight of the past has been lifted, replaced by the exhilarating, terrifying freedom of a woman who has nothing left to hide and everything left to give. I am Dr. Morgana Stone. I am 34 years old, and I have just performed the most successful operation of my career, the total extraction of the Vanderbilt influence from my soul. I drive away from the hotel, the engine of the Porsche humming a low, powerful frequency that vibrates through the steering wheel, and I don't look back at the gilded windows of the ballroom once. The debt has been settled, the facts have been filed, and for the first time in a decade, the silence in my life isn't something I'm being paid for. It's something I've finally earned. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as the lights of Manhattan blur into a golden streak in my rearview mirror, I realize that I am finally, truly, going home to the only family that ever mattered. Today, the architectural grandeur of the Vanderbilt name is nothing more than a cautionary footnote in the annals of Manhattan's social history, as Chase Vanderbilt sits at the absolute bottom of the national transplant waiting list because he failed his mandatory 6-month sobriety requirements, a clinical reality that no amount of offshore money or heritage can bypass. Beatrice is currently in the process of liquidating their sprawling Greenwich estate and the Azimut yacht to cover the avalanche of shareholder lawsuits and forensic audit penalties that followed my disclosure at the gala, their $400 million empire dissolving into a slurry of legal fees and public disgrace. And me? I am sitting in the quiet, sun-drenched sanctuary of my new $6 million penthouse overlooking Central Park, sipping a pumpkin spice latte and watching the golden hour light play across the museum-quality molding of a home I bought with my own hard-earned surgical fees and professional achievements. On my solid walnut desk sits a framed photograph of my daughter, her eyes bright with a freedom she will never have to pay for, whose Ivy League tuition and graduate school funds are already secured in a trust that is fully paid in full for the next 15 years of her life. The silence in my home is not the heavy, purchased silence of an NDA, but the peaceful, resonant quiet of a woman who has finally closed the ledger on a decade of debt. I look out the floor-to-ceiling windows and see the city stretching out toward the horizon. And for the first time, I don't see a battlefield or a grid of Vanderbilt-owned skyscrapers. I see a world that I navigated on my own terms, using nothing but my intellect and the steady hands that the Vanderbilts once deemed unworthy of their lineage. I remember the sound of the 14 drips a minute in that 380-square-foot studio and the way the rusted floorboards of my 2012 Ford Focus used to vibrate on the highway, and those memories no longer carry the sting of shame, but the weight of a Medal of Honor. I spent 10 years becoming a ghost so that I could eventually become a giant, and as I watched the sunset cast long, violet shadows over the park, I realized that the $85,000 was the most expensive lesson Beatrice Vanderbilt ever had to learn, because it taught me that you can never truly own someone who is willing to wait for the truth to emerge. The irony of Julian's situation is a cold, clinical fact that I process with the same detachment I use to read a pathology report. He is currently being treated at a state-funded facility because the Vanderbilt's private insurance was revoked following the discovery of the fraudulent medical claims Chase filed, a poetic justice that places the Prince of Manhattan in the very same public wards he once looked down upon. I performed the surgery, as I promised, because my integrity as a Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery is not a commodity that can be traded for spite, but the recovery is now in the hands of a system that does not care about his last name. Beatrice has tried to call me 16 times in the last 48 hours, her voice on the voicemails sounding thin and brittle, stripped of the Clive Christian perfume and the Harry Winston diamonds, but I have blocked her number and moved on to a frequency she can no longer reach. I am no longer the smudge on her biography. I am the author of my own life, and the chapter involving the Vanderbilts has been permanently redacted by the sheer force of my success. My daughter walked into the room just a few moments ago, her backpack filled with books about marine biology and the same fierce determination in her eyes that I used to survive medical school, and she asked me why I was smiling at a blank wall. I told her I was just thinking about how important it is to keep a good record of the things that matter, and she nodded with an innocence that I will spend the rest of my life protecting from people like her grandmother. She doesn't know about the Manila folder or the black ledger, and she will never have to know the price that was paid for her to sit in a room this beautiful and breathe air this clean. I have ensured that the legacy she inherits is one of surgical precision and unwavering dignity, not one of predatory mortgages and non-disclosure agreements. As I finish my latte, the ceramic warm against my palms, I feel a sense of completion that transcends the professional accolades and the $580,000 salary. I feel the peace of a woman who looked into the abyss of a billionaire's contempt and didn't blink until the abyss looked away. The Vanderbilt estate sale is scheduled for next Tuesday, and I heard through the professional grapevine that the Clive Christian perfume collection and the custom Oscar de la Renta gowns are being auctioned off to settle back taxes, a final stripping away of the ornaments that Beatrice used to masquerade as a human being. I don't feel joy at their downfall, for that would require me to still care about their existence. I feel only the satisfaction of a corrected error in a long, complicated equation. The $85,000 was long ago donated to a scholarship fund for single mothers in Scranton, Pennsylvania, ensuring that the money meant to buy my silence is now used to give other women a voice. I have turned their weapon into a tool for growth, their trauma into a foundation for excellence, and their smudge into a masterpiece of resilience. I think about the hospital restroom at 3:14 a.m. and the rough paper towel where this all began. And I realize that the most important fact I ever recorded wasn't Chase's toxicology report or the forensic audit of their nonprofit. It was the fact that my worth was never something they had the power to decide. I look at the clock on my wall, the same $4,000 minimalist masterpiece, and I see it as time to take my daughter to her violin lesson, a lesson taught by a teacher who is paid a fair, professional wage and who sees the talent in her fingers, not the potential for a social climbing maneuver. We walk out of the penthouse together, the elevator descending in a smooth, silent motion that feels like the opposite of a fall, and we step out into the crisp New York air as two people who belong to no one but themselves. The world of the Vanderbilts was a world of velvet ropes and private entrances, but the world I have built is a world of open hearts and steady hands. I am Dr. Morgana Stone. I am 34 years old, and I am the living proof that a smudge can become a signature if you have the courage to write your own story. The comments on the gala have died down, replaced by the next scandal or the next tragedy, but the shift in my soul is permanent and irreversible. Family isn't blood. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out. And as I hold my daughter's hand while we cross the street toward the park, I know that I am finally, undeniably part of a family that money could never buy and power could never break. The latte was sweet, the view is spectacular, and the future is a wide open sky that no longer has a price tag attached to it. I am done with the black ledger and the 4-inch thick manila folders. I am ready for the simple, quiet beauty of a life where the only thing that needs to be verified is the love in this room. The Vanderbilts are a ghost story I tell myself to remember how far I've come, a shadow that only serves to make the light in my penthouse feel that much brighter. I have performed the ultimate extraction, and the patient, my life, is finally in stable condition, breathing on its own, and expected to make a full, magnificent recovery. This is the end of the Vanderbilt biography as far as I am concerned, and the beginning of a story that is entirely, beautifully, and surgically mine. I have won the war of the facts, and the only fact that remains is that I am free, I am successful, and I am whole. There are no more drips to count, no more ramen to eat, and no more silence to sell. There is only the music of my daughter's violin and the steady, unbreakable rhythm of a heart that is finally, truly at home.